She was forced to marry her half-brother. The anonymous caller whispered into the phone before the line went dead, leaving Viola Jenkins staring at the case file marked Hollow Creek Valley. The wedding had happened 3 weeks ago, but the screaming still echoed through the mountain compound where Elder Josiah's word was absolute law, where bloodlines stayed pure, and where speaking to outsiders meant death. Would Viola arrive before the bride disappeared forever? She was forced to marry her half-brother. The anonymous caller whispered into the phone before the line went dead, leaving Viola Jenkins staring at the case file marked Hollow Creek Valley. The wedding had happened 3 weeks ago, but the screaming still echoed through the mountain compound where Elder Josiah's word was absolute law, where bloodlines stayed pure, and where speaking to outsiders meant death. Would Viola arrive before the bride disappeared forever? The dirt road wound through West Virginia mountains like a broken spine, each turn taking Viola Jenkins deeper into isolation. Her stay-tissued Ford struggled up the final ridge, engine coughing against the September heat. Hollow Creek Valley spread below her, a pocket of forgotten America where electricity poles ended and time seemed frozen in sepia tones. The Whitlock compound sat at the valley's heart, a cluster of weathered cabins surrounding a 2-story farmhouse that commanded the settlement like a watchtower. Viola parked beside a rusted water pump and stepped into air thick with wood smoke and something else, something sour that made her stomach turn. She adjusted her state identification badge and smoothed her professional skirt, armor against whatever waited ahead. The anonymous caller's words echoed in her memory as children's faces appeared in cabin doorways, pale and curious, watching her approach. A woman emerged from the main house, her movements sharp with territorial warning. Martha Whitlock possessed the weathered beauty of mountain women, but her eyes held decades of buried secrets. Her dress hung loose on a frame that had borne too many children too young, and her hands twisted constantly at her apron strings. Viola introduced herself as a social worker investigating reports of child neglect. Martha's response came clipped and defensive, explaining that government people weren't welcome in God-fearing homes. The children were fine, blessed and cared for according to the Lord's plan. Outsiders couldn't understand their ways, but Viola's trained eye caught details that contradicted Martha's words. The children clustering around cabin doorways displayed a troubling pattern of abnormalities. Several showed signs of developmental delays, their movements uncoordinated despite appearing physically healthy. Others bore subtle physical markers that suggested genetic complications. A boy of perhaps 8 had the distinctive facial features associated with chromosomal disorders, while his sister's eyes held the unfocused quality of severe cognitive impairment. More disturbing was how the children addressed the adults. A girl called 3 different women "mama" within minutes, while boys referred to multiple men as "daddy" without apparent confusion. When Viola asked about family relationships, the children's responses made no logical sense. Brothers and sisters shared identical surnames but claimed different parents, and ages seemed divorced from obvious family hierarchies. Martha guided Viola toward a smaller cabin where they might discuss matters privately, but the tour felt choreographed to avoid certain areas. They skirted the church building entirely, though Viola glimpsed through its windows what appeared to be a meeting hall with handwritten genealogy charts covering every wall. When she asked about the building's purpose, Martha claimed it served for Sunday worship and community gatherings, nothing more. The medical situation proved equally concerning. Dr. Henry Morrison, the valley's only physician, met them at his makeshift clinic in the farmhouse basement. A nervous man with prematurely gray hair, he spoke in careful, measured phrases that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. Birth records were kept private for religious reasons. Medical histories remained confidential. The children's unusual appearances stemmed from their isolated environment and unique genetic heritage, nothing that required outside intervention. But his hands shook as he filed away medical charts, and his eyes refused to meet Viola's direct gaze. When she asked about infant mortality rates and genetic counseling, he claimed such modern concerns didn't apply to communities blessed with natural hardiness. His answers felt rehearsed, protective walls built around dangerous truths. Sarah Mee Whitlock appeared at the clinic door like a ghost seeking salvation. 16 years old and visibly pregnant, she moved with the careful steps of someone expecting pain. Her wedding ring, a simple band that looked handmade, seemed to weigh down her entire hand. When introduced as Thomas Whitlock's new wife, she flinched at his name and instinctively touched her stomach as if protecting the child within. The girl's resemblance to Thomas was unmistakable. They shared identical eye color, the same distinctive nose shape, and matching birthmarks on their left hands. When Viola mentioned the similarity, Martha quickly explained that mountain families often shared strong features due to their common ancestry. Nothing unusual about that, she insisted, though her voice rose defensively. Sarah Mee rarely spoke, but her eyes followed Viola with desperate hope. She clutched a torn photograph against her chest, hiding it quickly whenever adults approached. The brief glimpse Viola caught showed a bearded man surrounded by multiple women in wedding dresses, their faces bearing the unmistakable similarities of sisters. The community's isolation became more apparent as evening approached. No telephone lines connected to the outside world. No postal delivery reached the valley. Supplies came monthly via a single truck that arrived like clockwork, suggesting someone coordinated their complete separation from mainstream society. The children had never attended public school, never seen television, never interacted with people beyond their small circle of related families. Religious authority permeated every conversation, though the actual religious leader remained mysteriously absent. References to elders' blessing and God's chosen bloodline peppered discussions, but no one would explain who this elder was or where his authority originated. Martha and Dr. Morrison deferred constantly to this unseen figure's wisdom and guidance. As darkness fell over Hollow Creek Valley, Viola realized she had stumbled into something far more complex than simple neglect. The patterns of abnormality, the defensive secrecy, the invisible religious authority controlling every aspect of community life, all pointed toward systematic abuse spanning generations. Sarah Mee's haunted eyes held the key to understanding, but reaching her would require navigating carefully around the protective walls of silence that imprisoned them all. Viola returned to Hollow Creek Valley before dawn, parking her Ford behind a stand of pine trees that concealed her approach. The anonymous caller had promised more information would be available if she looked in the right places, and Sarah Mee's desperate eyes haunted her dreams. She needed evidence before the state would authorize a full investigation into what appeared to be systematic abuse. The church building stood unlocked in the pre-dawn darkness, its door creaking open to reveal the genealogy charts she had glimpsed earlier. By flashlight, Viola copied the intricate family trees that covered every wall like obsessive documentation of genetic manipulation. The charts revealed a horrifying pattern spanning 4 generations. Brothers married sisters consistently across decades. Cousins paired with cousins in endless loops. Children born to mothers who were simultaneously their aunts, creating family relationships that defied natural order. The names repeated in impossible combinations. Martha Whitlock appeared as both daughter and wife to the same man. Sarah Mee's parents were listed as half-siblings who shared the same father. Thomas Whitlock, Sarah Mee's new husband, showed up on the charts as her half-brother through their common mother. The systematic nature of these pairings suggested deliberate orchestration rather than coincidental isolation. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, Viola discovered additional documents that painted an even darker picture. Medical records dating back decades showed alarming patterns of stillbirths, infant mortality, and genetic disorders. Children born with severe abnormalities were documented clinically, but their deaths were listed as natural causes or acts of God. Dr. Morrison's handwriting appeared throughout, recording genetic complications while simultaneously certifying the marriages that caused them. Birth certificates revealed Dr. Morrison's complicity in falsifying official documents. Siblings were listed with different fathers to obscure their genetic relationships. Birth dates were altered to make underage marriages appear legal. Death certificates omitted mention of genetic abnormalities, instead citing fever or respiratory failure as causes of infant mortality that clearly stemmed from inbreeding complications. Sarah Mee found Viola in the church as morning light filtered through cracked windows. The pregnant teenager moved carefully, her body showing signs of trauma beyond her difficult pregnancy. She carried the torn photograph Viola had seen earlier, finally revealing its complete image. The bearded man at its center commanded attention through sheer physical presence, his eyes holding the fanatic intensity of absolute authority. Elder Josiah Whitlock had orchestrated every marriage in the valley since arriving in 1875. Sarah Mee's whispered testimony revealed the systematic nature of his control. He claimed divine inspiration guided his selection of breeding pairs, maintaining that only through careful bloodline preservation could God's chosen people remain pure. Outsiders carried spiritual contamination that would corrupt their sacred heritage. Marriage between relatives concentrated divine blessing rather than creating genetic problems. The girls' wedding night had been a ritualized assault disguised as religious ceremony. Elder Josiah presided over the consummation, claiming spiritual authority required his presence to bless the union. Thomas, her half-brother and new husband, showed no recognition of their genetic relationship or concern for her age and terror. The community celebrated the marriage as another step toward achieving perfect bloodline purity. Martha Whitlock's arrival interrupted Sarah Mee's testimony, but instead of anger, her face showed decades of suppressed pain finally breaking through protective walls. She had endured the same systematic abuse, forced to marry her half-brother at 15 and bear 6 children despite knowing the genetic risks. 3 babies died within days of birth due to severe abnormalities, while the surviving children struggled with developmental delays and physical complications. Her confession revealed the scope of Elder Josiah's manipulation. He maintained absolute control through religious authority, claiming that questioning his breeding selections constituted rebellion against God's will. Women who resisted faced spiritual punishment and physical isolation. Children born with obvious genetic problems were hidden from outsiders or allowed to die without medical intervention, their deaths attributed to divine judgment rather than genetic inevitability. Dr. Morrison's involvement extended beyond falsifying documents. He had covered up decades of infant mortality and genetic complications to protect the community's isolation. State health inspectors received falsified records showing normal birth and death rates. Genetic abnormalities were reframed as spiritual tests or environmental adaptations rather than inbreeding consequences. The doctor's conscience finally cracked under Viola's persistent questioning. His medical training made him fully aware of the genetic damage being perpetuated across generations, but Elder Josiah's authority and the community's isolation had trapped him in complicity. Each falsified certificate and covered-up death added to his burden of guilt, until maintaining the deception became more painful than revealing the truth. Sarah Mee's pregnancy represented the culmination of 4 generations of systematic inbreeding. Medical tests revealed severe fetal abnormalities that Dr. Morrison had hidden from both parents. The unborn child showed genetic damage consistent with children born to siblings who were themselves products of incestuous relationships. The probability of the baby surviving birth was minimal, and if it lived, it would face severe developmental disabilities and physical complications. The evidence painted a complete picture of systematic abuse disguised as religious practice. Elder Josiah had created a closed genetic system designed to maintain his absolute authority while gradually destroying the people under his control. Each generation showed increasing genetic damage, but his religious explanations prevented community members from understanding the scientific reality of their situation. Martha's decision to support Viola's investigation marked the first crack in Elder Josiah's absolute control. Her willingness to testify against the man who had controlled her life since childhood gave other women permission to consider breaking their silence. Sarah Mee's courage in revealing her wedding night trauma provided evidence of ongoing abuse that could not be dismissed as historical injustice. The genealogy charts, medical records, and personal testimonies created an undeniable case for state intervention. Elder Josiah's systematic manipulation of marriages, Dr. Morrison's falsification of official documents, and the community's isolation from outside oversight had created conditions where genetic abuse continued unchecked across multiple generations. The state authorities arrived at Hollow Creek Valley 3 days after Viola's report reached Charleston, their convoy of official vehicles winding down the mountain road like a mechanical invasion of the forgotten world. Elder Josiah Whitlock emerged from the main farmhouse for the first time in decades, his imposing figure commanding attention even as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The bearded patriarch showed no surprise at his arrest, only cold fury at the disruption of his carefully constructed kingdom. His presence filled the valley with tangible menace even in restraint. At 78 years old, Josiah retained the physical strength and mental sharpness that had allowed him to dominate the community for nearly 50 years. His eyes held the fanatical certainty of a man who genuinely believed divine authority flowed through his decisions, making resistance to his will equivalent to rebellion against God himself. The confrontation between Viola and Josiah revealed the full scope of his delusions. He cited biblical passages supporting marriage between relatives, claiming that Abraham married his half-sister and Jacob wed his cousins according to divine plan. Modern society's rejection of such unions represented spiritual corruption that his community had successfully avoided through careful isolation. The genetic problems affecting his followers were temporary trials that would strengthen their bloodline through divine selection. Martha Whitlock's testimony before the state investigators marked the beginning of systematic justice. Her detailed account of forced marriage, repeated pregnancies despite known genetic risks, and decades of suppressed medical evidence provided the legal foundation for criminal charges. Other women slowly joined her testimony, their voices growing stronger as Josiah's physical presence was removed from the valley. Dr. Morrison's confession completed the evidentiary chain connecting religious manipulation to medical malpractice. He provided investigators with hidden medical records documenting the true extent of genetic damage across 4 generations. His falsified birth certificates, death certificates, and health reports had enabled the systematic abuse to continue without outside detection. The weight of complicity in decades of preventable suffering finally drove him to complete cooperation with authorities. Sarah Mee's courage in testifying about her forced marriage provided the most compelling evidence of ongoing abuse. Her detailed account of the wedding ceremony, consummation ritual, and subsequent treatment revealed how religious authority was used to justify systematic sexual abuse of minors. The pregnancy resulting from rape by her half-brother represented both the continuation of genetic damage and the immediate need for medical intervention. The medical evaluation of Sarah Mee's pregnancy confirmed the worst predictions about genetic consequences. The fetal abnormalities were so severe that survival beyond birth was impossible, and carrying the pregnancy to term posed serious risks to Sarah Mee's own health. The difficult decision to terminate the pregnancy was made with full understanding of the genetic realities that Elder Josiah had hidden behind religious justification. State social workers began the complex process of removing children from the compound while evaluating their medical and educational needs. Many of the younger children had never received formal education, medical care, or interaction with people outside their extended family network. The older children faced the additional challenge of understanding that their marriages and pregnancies resulted from genetic manipulation rather than divine blessing. The legal proceedings against Elder Josiah and his accomplices moved swiftly once the evidence was compiled. Charges included conspiracy to commit child abuse, falsification of government documents, practicing medicine without proper oversight, and multiple counts of arranging illegal marriages between minors and relatives. The systematic nature of the crimes and their continuation across decades supported enhanced penalties under federal civil rights statutes. Martha Whitlock's transformation from victim to advocate provided hope for other isolated communities facing similar abuse. Her willingness to speak publicly about her experiences helped identify warning signs that social workers and law enforcement could recognize in other religious communities that practiced extreme isolation. Her testimony before state legislative committees contributed to strengthened laws protecting children in isolated religious settings. The compound's abandonment happened gradually as families scattered to seek normal lives with proper support services. Some community members struggled to adapt to mainstream society after decades of isolation, requiring extensive counseling and educational assistance. Others embraced the opportunity to escape genetic predetermination and make independent choices about marriage and reproduction. Sarah Mee's recovery process began with basic education, as she learned to read and write for the first time at age 16. Her intelligence, freed from religious suppression and genetic damage, proved remarkable. She absorbed academic subjects with the hunger of someone discovering intellectual freedom after years of enforced ignorance. Her dream of becoming a social worker like Viola provided motivation for the difficult work of healing from trauma. The legislative changes inspired by the Hollow Creek case created new protections for children in isolated religious communities. Mandatory education requirements, regular medical examinations, and genetic counseling for planned marriages became legal obligations that religious isolation could not override. The laws balanced religious freedom with children's rights to protection from systematic abuse. Viola's final visit to the abandoned compound found wildflowers growing through the floorboards of the church where genealogy charts once mapped genetic manipulation. The natural reclamation of the buildings symbolized healing processes that would take generations to complete. The children removed from Hollow Creek would need lifelong support to overcome the genetic and psychological damage inflicted by Elder Josiah's systematic abuse. Sarah Mee planted flowers on the small graves behind the church, marking the resting places of babies who died from genetic complications that could have been prevented. Each flower represented hope that future generations would be free from the systematic manipulation that had destroyed so many young lives. The simple act of remembrance honored the victims, while affirming the possibility of breaking cycles of abuse through courage, truth, and proper intervention. The valley returned to natural silence, but the lessons learned from its systematic abuse continued protecting children in other isolated communities, where religious authority threatened to override basic human rights and genetic health.